Sam Jacob is an architect, writer, and editor. He is currently principal of Sam Jacob Studio for Architecture and Design and is also the professor of architecture at the University of Illinois, visiting professor at Yale School of Architecture, and director of night school at the Architecture Association. Previously, Sam was a founding director of the FAT Architecture. In the book Make It Real, Architecture as Enactment, it states, "Architecture is all just an attempt to make what's not real look real." There then, Sam Jacob explains postmodernism as a more general enactment of architecture rather than something being set against modernism. Under Jacob's statement, postmodernism architecture is a free expressing architecture theory developing around the central idea of realizing fiction. However, critiques point out that, in architecture, function plays a more important role. Although postmodernism reflects a materialistic simplicity of a modernistic representation, it does not engender the decorative simplicity functioning only for its purpose. At the time he founded his studio, Jacob's reputation as a critic eclipsed his reputation as an architect. In academic circles, it was fashionable to celebrate his writing while scorning his designs. While FAT progressed largely through intuition and attitude, Sam Jacob's studio began with a manifesto and an ambition. Making real architecture as enactment prefigured in words what Jacob's architecture will eventually realize over the subsequent 2 decades. An instant classic, the book was first published by Stratcog Press in 2012 and then stand-alone essay in a digital format, only to be circulated among the generation of architecture students as a bootleg PDF. Jacob's essay is often cited as a foundational text of the radical postmodernism movement. These architects and critics distinguish themselves from the classic postmodernists in their tone. They weren't playing postmodernism as an endgame. During this period of time, a tomb that was designed but never realized by the modernist architect Adolf Loos has been built by Sam Jacob in a historical London cemetery. Jacob describes the structure as a ghostly reenactment of an unrealized architecture idea. Though never built, the image of Loos' design has haunted architecture culture ever since, he explained.
Make It Real celebrated the inexhaustibility of the present instead of brooding over the end of history. Make It Real described architecture as a special mode of cultural production, the perfect coincidence of the fictional and the real. For Jacob, architecture emerged when fiction was fully recombined across time and space in acts of anachronic radicalism. As others have written, the distinction between fictional and real was full of ambiguity and contradiction. It was this claim that Petro Pobo, who soon emerged as Jacob's fiercest critic, found superficial. Her 2018 book, Materiality and Materialism in Architecture Production, argued for an architectural realism that was diametrically opposed to Jacob's more casual concept of the real. Pobo argued that an architecture based on the play of cultural references was simply recapitulating the ideology of burgeoning tech economy. When pressed to elaborate on her objections to Sam Jacob Studio's work, she replied,
"I certainly don't intend to dismiss the work as trivial. That's the most obvious reaction, and I want to move beyond that, but there's nothing there. The minute you try to really look at it, it evaporates. They're not really talking about the things that actually drive cultural production. Frankly, it's a little dishonest to suggest that the surface of things is all that matters. There's an underlying structure, and we ignore that aspect at our peril."
This response is revealing, not only because it points to Pobo's enduring attachment to a notion of culture as epiphenomenon, but also because she sensed that Jacob's attention to myths and ephemera was muddying the water. For her, the real could not be felt, but only assessed through the intellectual analysis of social-economic conditions. She rejected any possibility that narrative or cultural significance could redirect architectural production under late capitalism. Her mode of architectural inquiry asked ontological questions, not stylistic ones. At a time when architects anxiously watched the wild proliferation of images on the internet and struggled to master the digital production techniques, a total collapse of the distinction between building and representation was a courageous proposition. A comparison of two sets of projects of either side of Make It Real will demonstrate how the shift from flatness to three-dimensionality became the vehicle of this idea of enactment. Enactment has two distinct definitions. First, it describes the theoretical acting out of a part or character, the dramatic representation or narrative through the performance of language, action, and gesture. Secondly, it is the moment a law is passed into effect by a legislative body.
In Sam Jacobs' book, Make It Real, Architecture as Enactment, he claims that he regards doing artworks as a way to use design as a form of realized science fiction, to invent new ways of being in the world or new kinds of worlds to be in. When he worked in FAT, he did design combining the practical demands of architecture with critical and provocative thinking. The Blue House, one of previous works done by FAT, showed Sam Jacobs and FAT's opinion on postmodernism architecture. From the street, it depicts the cutout form of a diminutive pitched roof house stuck onto a cartoon office block. It featured a number of abstract elements, including an extended chimney and angular window boxes, which were partially screened behind the original parapet wall. Jacob once said, when he was interviewed, "We were looking at the limits of architecture, trying to find moments that you could appropriate or subvert how the city works." Bonaventure House, located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was a small building designed by Robert Venturi for his mother. It is one of the most best-known buildings for both Robert Venturi and postmodernism. The design follows the architectural style of the Italian architecture Palladio in the 16th century, which helps the house become a representative architecture with commemorative significance on the facade along the street. He believed that what the public liked was not a simple square box, but ordinary with no lack of decoration and metaphorical architecture. His books, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture and Learning from Las Vegas, were regarded as proclamations of postmodernism. He, against Mies van der Rohe's famous proclamation, "Less is more," and replied, "Less is a bore," of postmodernism.
Overall, the key word of Sam Jacobs' postmodernism seems to be broadness, which the postmodernism, according to his argument, suggests a conclusive method for broader future adoptions. By suggesting architecture's features of approaching fiction and repetitive, Sam Jacobs tries to define postmodernism as a universal architectural language, usable under a variety of cultural and history contents. However, this kind of ambition also put him into doubts. On one hand, the inclusiveness pushes the theory itself too vague to be defined and supported by specific architectures. On the other hand, Sam Jacobs himself has not been able to come up with persuasive projects to defend himself against critics.